What are groups? How do they work? How do they function? How can we use them to organize our layouts and our documents here inside Corel? Well, all of this is exactly what this lesson is all about. So if you don't have some shapes laid out onto your page, go ahead and throw a couple down and throw in some fill colors there so you can actually see them. And by the way, I know that I've been using really simple shapes for the last little while. The whole idea is I really want to keep this simple and straightforward. And I want to have you focusing on the concepts like transforming or grouping here or some of the things that we have coming up rather than getting hung up on some kind of crazy design or crazy layout or sample file. So here's the deal. As you know already, we have these individual shapes. I've got my pick tool selected inside the toolbox, of course. And as you know, I can hold down the Shift key and I can select multiple shapes if I want, or I can hold down the Shift key and I can subtract shapes from my selection, something like this, right? Well, what I can do though is I can select a few shapes, maybe something like this, and while those shapes are selected, I can move them around in unison, I can scale them in unison, and as a matter of fact, I can use all of the transform commands that we've already seen and use them on this set of shapes, right? But this set of shapes isn't permanently grouped. They're not permanently attached to one another. As soon as I click away into some white space, well then they become independent objects again, right? So the idea of grouping, what that means is locking two objects together. Now those objects, you could take, for example, a shape like I have here and some text and then group them together. Or I could take a symbol and some text and maybe a circle and group all those together. You can mix and match a little bit here. It's pretty cool. Let me show you how this is going to work. I'm going to take one of my shapes here. I'm going to make sure he's selected. I'll hold down Shift and I'll grab a second shape. There we are. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to group them together by heading up to the Arrange menu and then down to Group. Or there's your keyboard shortcut, Control-G, an easy one to remember. Once you choose Group, what happens now is if I click away into some white space and then go back to my green polygon there and I click on them, well, the orange square in my example also gets selected. In other words, they're grouped together. Imagine they're like Siamese twins now. Whatever happens to one happens to the other, right? So that's really the idea. That's how this all works. And, you know, again, if I scale one, they both scale. If I click one more time to rotate one of them, they both rotate. They both skew, and so on and so on. That's really the idea here. That's really how it all works. I hope that makes sense for you. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to undo a couple of steps here. I'll just use my undo button up on my toolbar. What's cool, too, is if I save my document and I come back to it at a later time, and these guys have been left as a grouped set, they're going to remain grouped until I come along at some point down the road and decide to ungroup them. So how do I break them apart into individual unique shapes? Well, that's easy stuff. I'll make sure that the group is selected here, and then I'll head up to my Arrange menu and then simply choose Ungroup. And what happens now is I now have these separate independent objects. That's how it works. That's grouping. So if you've wondered what grouping is or if it's hung you up in the past, that's all there is to it. Now, you can use grouping to pull off some pretty cool things. A lot of times I'll use grouping to help me organize and arrange my layouts. Maybe if I were doing a newsletter and say I had the headline or the name of the newsletter right across the top, and then, you know, a lot of times you'll have, you know, the date and maybe the issue number and the volume number, all that stuff. Well, I might take all that stuff and group it together, so then that entire layout component is all going to move together. Everything's attached, right? But you can do some other cool things too. Let me show you this. I'm going to take these two shapes here, the first two shapes that I had. I'm going to select them both, and I'll go and group them. I'll head up to the Arrange menu and then down to Group. So now they're locked together, right? No big deal. And I'm going to do the same thing for these two shapes down here. I'll select one, hold down Shift, click on the other. Let's go and group these guys. So Arrange and then down to Group. So obviously now I've got two independent groups, right? Well, what I'm going to do, I don't know if you can guess where I'm headed here, but I'm going to take these two groups and I'm going to make them into one single group. So all of a sudden now I have a group that's comprised of two groups. Does that make sense? So I'll select one group, hold down Shift, click on the second group, head up to the Arrange menu, down to Group, And now I've got one single massive group. I can scale all of the objects all in one shot. I can rotate the objects all in one shot, and so on and so on. So there you go. You can do some pretty cool things. And what's interesting here is now that I have one massive group, what I could do is I could head up to the Arrange menu and I could say Ungroup. And what that does in this particular situation is it would ungroup one level, if that makes sense. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to choose Ungroup here. And now I'm back to the two independent groups, right? Now, what I'll do is I'll hold down Shift and I'll regroup these guys because there's another command I want to show you. Group them all back together. So now there's one single group. With that single group selected, I'll go Arrange and then I'll choose Ungroup All. Now, what does that do? Well, I'm going to choose Ungroup All, and now what happens is all of the shapes become independent objects. It's kind of like undo everything. Take everything inside this selection and break it all apart into their individual components. So there you go. There's grouping.
To change up.